Hello, everyone. This is Dr. Flummerfelt. Welcome to PowerPoint 6 for School Business Management. This will be a little bit more on legislative funding for schools and also school bond basics to kind of give you an idea of how these things work. So we're going to just focus on the state of Michigan and some of the legislative actions that have been taken that have impacted school funding. And it'll all go back to some of the things we've been studying in previous lectures as well. So hopefully this will tie it together for you on school business management funding. So kind of what's happened in the past is current funding for schools has tended to be greater than previous funding. And that's always happened because the government, both the federal and state governments, have perceived future opportunities being greater than current opportunities. So you saw that, for instance, like with IDEA and the National Defense Education Act and so on. There were opportunities that were seen in education, and so funding numbers tended to be increased. But what is happening lately, and this has been in the past even 10 or 15 years, is that current funding levels have become in jeopardy in terms of not being able to rely on an increase from previous funding levels. And that's because future opportunities for improvement are seen as being less than what is currently on the table. So the accountability movement has been very significant in terms of impacting school funding. And I really don't think there's anything wrong with it. If funding, increases, we should be getting more opportunities, better results, and so on. If that in fact is not happening, then I think we need to call into question what we're funding. Now, this doesn't mean that funding will answer our problems necessarily in school improvement. In fact, funding needs to be adequate. It needs to be able to address the needs of equity and equality, but it doesn't mean that funding is the only way we can solve school problems. In fact, I've done a lot of consulting work on helping schools to identify solutions to problems and barriers that are there. And oftentimes our solutions require small amounts of funding or even no funding at all. It's a matter of the way we're thinking about doing it. We don't have an unlimited marketplace in funding in education for funding. We actually, in fact, have a very limited population and a limited amount of customers, that we can service. So we have to start looking at this, and certainly in regards to current funding and the levels going down, we know in the state of Michigan, for instance, we have declining student population. So our funding numbers will go down, which will impact certainly how we make our decisions around school business management. So one of the things that has happened with the accountability movement is trying to look at return on investment. And this is something that you have some earlier lectures on. We have to really understand this because the idea that there is an educational marketplace is certainly happening now, that in fact we do have competition, and survival of the fittest are the school systems who are going to take a look at a possible future or not. And so previously to this is that we didn't really see education in this way. Like I said, we always saw that there were opportunities and that competition can grow, the marketplace can grow, we're looking to support and so on. But now we're really looking heavily at the economic foundation here. And so a lot is being done in some states, in terms of looking at not only charter schools like we have in Michigan, but voucher systems. Those are starting to come out in the majority of the states right now nationally, which increases competition and, looks for the survival of the fittest in terms of education. So if we have this going on and we have desires that we are looking for or the marketplace looks for, and we don't have the resources to support it. Now we have scarcity. Now we have choice really coming into the picture. So these things are real pressures on us in education. So we need to be able to quantify the economic value of education. And as you saw in the Smarter Budget, Smarter Schools book from Levinson, he really has a very, very clear way of outlining this, where, you know, he is talking about it's okay. Our academic return on investment should be related to, of course, our mission, our purpose. He really focuses on achievement. And a part of that is also impacted by mission, purpose, and teacher quality. But he looks for an increase in student learning times the number of students helped divided by the dollar spent. And so if you want a very concrete way to have this value equated and quantified, I think that's a really great way to do it. So anyway, all of these things we're looking at, and a lot of the accountability movement, we're evaluating teacher quality against student achievement, administrator quality against student achievement, and so on. So applying the economic system to education is, what do we do? Should we make it survival of the fittest and see who survives? Well, that's not really fair, because education is guaranteed. So it's not like the true economic marketplace where some companies survive and some don't. If it's survival of the fittest and some school systems go away, what is going to be provided? We still have to provide something there. So do we look at merit? Do we look at most competitive? Do we look at, what is the most scarce thing and the most desirable? All of these questions are really prevalent right now in the political debate around education. So normally, as I mentioned, education has not been questioned within our capitalistic society. So is it valuable? I mean, it's foundationally and ideologically thought of as being valuable in a civil society, in our constitutional republic. So it is considered valuable, but now how valuable is coming into question. What does it mean? And so do we look at education as capital, or is it an expense? Is it both? And so I'm going to share with you some research that's been done on this. And so we have people like Galbraith and Friedman who have developed this idea, something called social capital. And so today, when we look at intellectual property and we look at who has knowledge, and knowledge is power, that is what social capital is about. And in our capitalistic society, we are understanding that social capital traditionally has been very much underdeveloped. So the more that this is being appreciated and highly valued, the more I think that will align with the purpose and mission of schools. And, this all comes along with the development of the knowledge economy, which is becoming more and more and more prevalent, of course, in these times. So we talk about education and the need for funding and increasing funding based on these ideas. I think we can obviously state the common good, the social good, the development of human capital, and also social capital. And sometimes people, in order to be able to go out and do things, contribute to society, and have jobs and find their own satisfaction, along with social capital, which again is the development of people as knowledge workers, and the idea that we know how to think, we know how to do our basics and so on, along with the individual good as well. And so what's happening now is that a lot of people had kind of thought about the educational system, the public educational system, including university systems and college systems, as being a part of, this is all really, really great. And so common good, social good, human capital, and now social capital. But what's starting to happen is because of the knowledge economy, knowledge is easier to get a hold of, and you don't have to get it through public education. So the individual good is becoming more and more important, where people will go out and, through open source and even maybe cheaper than paying for college programs and so on, they will get what they need to get to be, to accomplish their goals. So individual good is definitely impacting us here in terms of what's driving the economy and education. So in the past, we normally would say that our GNP, our gross national product, is the combination of land, labor, and capital. Within GNP now, we are starting to recognize the value of social capital, and this is really important for us in education, because even back in 61 and 62, there was a lot of research that was being published by Schultz and Dennison, where Schultz says that education was shown from 1929 to 1957 to result in a 36 to 70% economic boost. Dennison, a little bit after that, did studies of 1909 to 57 and 73 to 81, where we see a 23% increase in productivity due to education, and then 33% increase in productivity. So our GNP is very closely tied to this notion of social capital. And we have long established studies. And again, this was ideologically where the country was founded on this idea that education is of paramount to success, to our productivity and economy. So now here in the state of Michigan, we had something called the Headley Amendment that came about in 1978. And what Headley was looking at is he was very concerned about this idea of, future spending being greater than current spending, because he was concerned about excessive spending, and that would have to happen through taxation, right? And increasing taxation on residents. And at this time, Michigan had a very, very high tax rate. And so it was causing, problems for citizens, for sure. Having a high tax rate, it's not positive to be a state with one of the highest tax rates in the country for growth and so on. So what Headley did is he said that the amount of revenue, which comes through taxation, state and federal revenue, was capped based on a state constitutional amendment. And so that passed. But what happened is that it didn't actually accomplish anything other than just keeping the tax rate lower. We still had problems actually in terms of both equal, equitable, and adequate funding. And so I'm going to take you through a little history here of something called Proposal A, and what that meant for us, along with the Durant versus the state of Michigan case. So Proposal A was introduced because, we had this free market for education, allegedly, and communities make choices from the resources that they have, and it really was the survival of the fittest. So Proposal A took the capitalistic competitive model and buffered it with the idea that we need to have some equity here in terms of what's happening with funding for our school districts. So it promoted the social significance of education. Again, it goes back to this idea that if our educational systems are not successful, it costs us a lot, not just in terms of educational failure, but the impacts on the economy, productivity, and the longevity of our society, become highly at stake. So Proposal A came about in the 90s, and it said, education is perhaps the most important function of state and local governments. Again, this is great for us. We're the cornerstone of society. It's the very foundation of good citizenship. In these days, it's doubtful that any child may reasonably be expected to succeed in life if he is denied the opportunity of the education. So again, this is about equality, equal access to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And such an opportunity where the state is undertaken to provide it is a right that must be made available to all on equal terms. And so that was Brown versus the Board of Ed. And Proposal A tried to reform not only equality, but to do it through an equitable and adequate allocation of resources. So it was based on, that we are violating equal protection, and that if we had Proposal A, we could have the standards of being thorough and efficient in terms of being equitable, right, where you're getting the results across the board. And the argument against Proposal A is that it actually didn't adequately equalize because, there are still some fundamental differences between communities due to wealth, what's called wealth suspectedness. So we actually didn't accomplish what we totally wanted to, but we had a lack of proof of equal protection because we had a lack of proof of causal relationship of inputs to achievement. So adequacy then started to surround our thinking. And that's where standards-based education that we have now became very important. And so we have these benchmarks of achievement. We have our common core standards state by state. We try to change and improve to meet the benchmarks, and then we fund based on those. So that is really being driven by adequacy because Proposal A didn't accomplish everything it was supposed to. It got us moving in the right direction. But what we're doing now with adequacy legislation is we aren't really fully addressing necessarily equality or equity. And we also have what are called unfunded mandates, where the state of Michigan will expect schools to provide certain programming and certain criteria with certain attributes and so on, but they don't provide the funding for the districts to do that. So we don't have adequate funding. So it's caused a lot of problems. And then, of course, do we have adequacy for both general and special populations in order to get that, to get those benchmarks of achievement and so on? So none of these things have been clear-cut solutions. So Odin, he comes from actually the state of Michigan, who does a great job around school finance. And I actually met him one time. We were happened to be going to a conference, and we shared a cab together to get there. And I figured out who he was. I'm like, oh, I know you. I quote you in my classes and so on. So he's really well known. But so he really, though, does feel that adequacy is a good way to do funding. That's because you can look at demographics along with past performance and needs for meeting the benchmark. So it gives you some of that flexibility, and that there should be a base formula for adequacy. And what he does is he says we should develop a capacity for quality by teacher compensation and other changes. We need clear competency standards and common metrics for performance, or KPIs. We should compensate teachers based on the scarcity of their knowledge, credentials, and performance. And this is interesting because this would mean that unions basically would not be able to negotiate common shared standards. There can be common standards for pay, but then there would be some diversification in that based on knowledge, credentials, and performance. And he believes that there should be cultures and climates for change and continuous improvement. And that's why, why I've devoted a lot of my work to the use of lean in schools, which you'll read about in the book that I wrote with Paul on transforming the way we do business. So this is really, really interesting work here that Odin has done. It's controversial. We're not there yet at all, but certainly there's some ideas here that, are worth debating for sure and have been. So let's just take a quick quiz. Did Proposition A eliminate property tax as a source of revenue? No, false. Did Prop A limit the district's ability to run a millage election? No, it did not, false. Did Prop A guarantee an annual increase in foundation For districts with foundation grant allowances that need to be leveled up, yes, true, that is what Proposition A did, is it did prop up the foundation allowance to create more equality and equity. And did Prop A increase equity in funding as districts with the highest share of African American and underserved populations experienced the largest foundation increases since 1994? That is true. It did do that. So you can see Prop A did get us moving in the right direction. Headley, I think, got us thinking about some interesting things as well. And so now we have, we have kind of a hodgepodge of things still going on with Prop A. And so it hasn't done everything that we wanted to, but if we look at the issue of did enrollment decline or increase? Did student population needs stay or go? The prior funding, was it high, medium, or low? And then what was the funding via Prop A? What was the impact? So you're going to see here that all kinds of things are happening here with Prop A. So let's say your enrollment declines. Well, your funding decreases because you have fewer FTE. If your enrollment increases, then your funding increased because you have more full-time equivalent students. How about if the high needs students stay? Well, you're going to have a decline in your funding because your program costs are remaining high. But if the high needs students leave, then you're going to have more funding because your program costs are, you have the same amount, but you're not serving as many high needs students. If you have a high foundation already, so your foundation allowance is there, and then you get additional funding based on different issues that are addressed in Prop A. So if you have a high foundation to begin with, well, you're going to get less because you have a high foundation. If it's medium, you'll probably stay about the same, or if it's low, you'll get an increase in funding. So you can see here, school districts every year are kind of jostling around to figure out what's going to actually be coming their way. And there's all these factors that influence that. So let's take an example here. So let's say if you have a rural area that's growing, your enrollment is increasing, and you're attracting general ed students, you're going to find a substantial increase in funding because these are not your high need students. If your area is rural or urban and declining, and your special needs students are staying, now you're going to have substantial decreases in funding. So Proposition A did not really do fully what it needed to do. And when we talk about no child left behind and we look at adequacy, it did not happen with Prop A. So guess what happened? Lawsuits started. So Proposition A did reduce property taxes under Stabenow-Engler. It was a rewards market-based growth, and it did reduce inequality. Now, the negatives is that there wasn't stability in funding and the reserves were gone, and it didn't hit adequacy. And so it did still continue to underfund and underserve the underserved populations in districts. So again, this did not happen to work as well as we thought it would. So for Prop A, what are we doing about it? Well, we can try for using some pro rata solutions where we're varying formulas across the districts and the programs. That is like a nightmare. It's a bad idea. We can exempt some revenue sources, the categorical and special needs, so that those get evened out, which don't get evened out with this. That's possible. We can go for uniform dollar reductions, which doesn't help anybody, or percentage reductions, which doesn't help anybody. So all of these are kind of funky ideas here, but all of them have been funky. So there's nothing that's been really clear that's worked well. So what we do to counteract Prop A is that our regional service agencies, our intermediate school districts can run millages. And the idea is let's get more shared services on a regional area put together, consolidate them. We can gain some economy of scale. And this also will get some of our districts with varying economic disparity in some cases working together. This doesn't work all over the place. For instance, the Upper Peninsula would be very different from the Lower Peninsula. You can, of course, increase property taxes, which is what we were trying to get away from with Headley. And then you can always use bond issues. So you can have millages and bonds. And this is the way that, local school districts can say, look, our funding allowance is just not enough. We have schools that were built in the 50s and we need to run a bond campaign because we have to get some things going here with updating our school. So major renovations, massive capital outlay and so on can be done through bonds. So before 1994, local property taxes were providing that school funding to districts, but this is where the values were higher. So if you go into an urban area or an underserved area where property taxes are very low, automatically those school systems have way less money to work with than the wealthier systems did. So after Proposal A, property taxation was capped at 5% or the inflation rate, which was guaranteed. There was a charter millage for schools. So this is like a guaranteed amount. So when property ownership changes, the cap is removed and then reinstituted. So if you sell your house and someone buying it is probably going to get taxed at a higher rate than the person who owned it previously. But what happens here is that if you are capping, if you're capping the taxation, it doesn't necessarily make real estate in underserved areas more attractive at all. So it has some problems there. And so there was a special category of what was called hold harmless schools that were created. And so this hold harmless piece here allowed for that, because just capping the property tax didn't mean that people were necessarily willing to pay more money for areas that were not as desirable in terms of real estate. So this hold harmless tried to put in a little intervention in there in creating some differences and equality in the funding. So then what happened, as mentioned earlier, is this caused all kinds of problems because many programs were being underfunded. So there's a famous lawsuit started by Durant versus the state of Michigan in 1980. It went on for 17 years, 18 years before it was finally settled. But basically what the lawsuit was done, there were 82 districts, so not everyone in the state joined the lawsuit. But they're saying that the Department of Education and the state government was requiring districts to set up programs for which the funding was inadequate. So they were underfunded, and they didn't have any way to do this, even with Headley in place at that time. So in 1998, finally, the districts won the lawsuit and a monetary settlement was ordered, so that those funds then were looked at and dispersed throughout the state of Michigan. So this means in the future that the state of Michigan was legally obligated to live up to its education mandates by providing adequate funding. Well, what does that mean? If you have, adequate funding, but let's say, you think you need money, but you actually have a lot of waste in your system, a lot of bureaucracy, a lot of ineffectiveness, then should that be funded? Well, no, that should not be funded. That would be fix your own place, and then, then we'll get you the funding. So anyway, this obviously isn't helping a lot, but it does move things forward to a certain extent. So just to kind of give you an idea of why school systems are so badly in need of bonds, because there's not a good way to solve these problems. And certainly with bonds, you have an opportunity not to handle operating expenses, but to do some things that are bigger, long-term capital expenditures, what we call CapEx types of projects. So when we look at bonds, there are three kinds. Corporate bonds, these are debts that are debt issuances that are traded on the secondary market. So you'd go to an organization and they would do it on your behalf, where they would raise the capital, and interest is then paid to investors. That's why investors would want to buy a bond, a corporate bond. And then these can be traded on the secondary market, kind of like mortgages are now. If you get a mortgage from a bank, those mortgages are often sold to another secondary mortgage holder, and they'll hold that debt, and then they will maybe sell it off or keep it or whatever. So that's how corporate bonds work. If you do a municipal bond, that's where the school system is taking on that obligation, right? And so it's a full faith or a credit bond, and these can be either qualified or non-qualified. So what happens is they get issued at a rate set by the local district, and the state obviously has to oversee this. And then they're backed by local school tax revenues. So there's going to be a big auditing that goes on and so on. And these municipal bonds are generally considered low risk for investors, because when you earn interest on that, and you buy a bond, it will pay interest, and that interest is tax deductible. Normally, when you gain money on any kind of an asset or investment or equity, that money is considered income. So whatever you earn on it, that's income, and you're taxed on that. So the tax is free. There's no tax here on municipal bonds, and so that's why investors like those. Then school systems can also do something called a sinking bond. And this is where they go to the voters and they ask for a levy to be issued. And a levy is an increase in taxes. And it is considered a debt-free way to do this for the school system, because they're just saying, look, we want all of you to just pay us this special assessment, basically. And therefore they pay it. And so there's no debt and no liability for the school system. These are overseen by the state as well. And school systems will do this sometimes for a rainy day fund, or if they see that there's going to be some things coming up in the future, and they can pay as they go out of this sinking bond fund. So it helps them just to keep the financial management and the cash flow management of the district in order. So those are the three kinds of bonds that you usually see in the state of Michigan. And so, what we have to do here with bonds is decide if you need one. And so as you set up your budgets and build those budgets, and we've talked about the different ways you can build up a budget, mission-based, zero-based, other ways, you have to ask, is this expenditure, is this need outside of what our typical, what our annual budget is or historically has been? And if it's yes, then you say, well, do we want to rate this bond or not? Do we receive the rating? And then do we purchase the insurance? So those are kind of the big internal things that happen out of the school business office. Normally, what will happen with these is that a school system will hire a consultancy to handle this whole sequence, this whole development of all of this, because it is such a huge task when you decide to run a bond, that it can be way too much. And it also helps to have it being done by an external organization. It does provide some protections then for the school system and the Board of Education. So what'll normally happen is a consultant will be hired, and then they'll go in and survey and analyze the debt structure, the resources, the financial standing, both past and present and predicted for the future. What do those budgets look like? What does the cash flow look like? What's going on here? So they'll do that analysis. And then what happens is oftentimes, in order for all of this to happen, there will be some work done, because a lot of times bonds have to do with facilities. And I'll give you the list of things you can spend money on and not. But oftentimes there is an architectural firm involved in this, because they're going to be providing projects and RFPs that will tell you, like, here's what this will cost. So then you start to say, okay, here's what it needs, here's how much we need. Now we set up a timeline. We talk about when this campaign is going to run, when it's going to start, when it's going to end. Is the state qualified it or not? And then also you'll work with a rating agency. That's where you're rating if you want it. You have to work with an outside rating agency like Moody's or Standard & Poor's. And then what you'll do is you'll put out your open bids that come back sealed. And this would be for your architectural firms, your construction firms, any of your specialty vendors, that might be involved in this, maybe technology or whatever it might be, right? And so normally the consultant then would open that sealed bid and then award them accordingly, and then print and deliver the bonds that go with it. So you can see this is a huge task if you decide to do this, but you can understand why school systems do need bonds oftentimes, and they need to run those bonds. And there's quite a bit of work that goes into that. So what can you run a bond for? Well, you can either build a new facility, remodel, or add on. It can be a school facility, athletic facility, and playgrounds. And, I've seen a lot of playgrounds recently be getting updated. I know the safety standards are definitely becoming more and more of a concern on playgrounds. And so there's all kinds of very stringent safety requirements. And so a lot of times bonds have to be run so that playgrounds can be updated. If you're doing things for energy conservation, your boilers, your heat pumps, your electrical, whatever it might be, any of your mechanicals. Of course, asbestos, a lot of our buildings were built. A lot of things were built way back in the 50s, and asbestos was all the rage, and was used in, insulation, for soundproofing, for siding. And so getting rid of asbestos is a very specialized safety measure that has to be taken, and it costs a lot of money to do that. School buses can be bought with bond money. You can develop land or purchase land or improve sites with bond money. You can actually include in the bond the cost of like your consultant and the audits and all the bond program costs, because it's not cheap to have all this work take place, but that can be built into the bond. The bond doesn't pass, then you have to figure out how you're going to pay for the cost of that. But if it does pass, then you're all set. And then refunding debt expenses, that's a possible way to get rid of some of your liability. And as long as you're purchasing furniture, furnishings, and equipment for technology, you're okay. You cannot use bonds to make regular repairs and maintenance for things that are consumable: supplies, salaries, contracts, leases, non-school bus vehicles, temporary portables. Those are very common: uniforms, textbooks, any kind of upgrades to your technology systems, the app upgrades that cannot be covered by a bond. You can buy the furniture and the tech and the equipment, but you can't do the upgrades or the training, maintenance, and consulting that would go with it. So it's very specific what bonds can be used for. And so it's not something that happens every day. So this is an example of some work I had done with a school system recently, where we were trying to set up a bond schedule routine within our building. So this was for school buildings and other facilities, where we were trying to look at, are we managing everything we have properly, so that we know when it needs a bond that will actually happen. So what we did is we first of all said, well, let's look at what we have in our inventory management system. And this would be, again, only the things that are allowable for a bond. So these would be your assets in your inventory, your boilers, things like that, school buses, and so on. So we would ask, is the useful life completed? Well, if it is completed, then yes, then we would go ahead, and now we have the assurance that this can go into a bond schedule. If no, then we need to, educate, examine, and enforce some other things. Maybe we're just not taking care of what we've got, and the useful life has not been completed. We can't use taxpayer money then, because we're being sloppy. Here's equipment being maintained by the building custodians based on the standard care instructions. So again, is the useful life completed? Yes, then good. We can replace it if it falls under the bond. If no, then we need to make sure we're doing the instructions properly. Are the instructions maintained? Yes, good. We recognize, reward, and replicate that. If not, educate, examine, and enforce. So you can see here, yes and no are the same all the way through here. Are the equipment managers conducting preventive maintenance? Is a useful life completed? Is the care instructions maintained? Are the care instructions maintained? Is preventive maintenance completed? Yes, great. No, problematic. So this is what I'm talking about when I said, a lot of times we can simply improve things internally and we don't necessarily need funding for that. And that's what we were looking at. Whenever we hit a no here, is there something we can do better? Yeah, we can manage this better. We can lead this better. We can train people better and so on. And then repairs being conducted again, useful life, care instructions maintained, preventive maintenance completed, is the repair completed. And so this was a way for the school system. It had many, many buildings. They were old, a lot of old buildings, and they were trying to figure out, what do we do here? Where do we focus our bond monies on? And are there things we need to do internally in terms of accountability to make sure that we're taking care of what we've been given already through funding? So this was kind of an interesting exercise in just getting the thinking right around how do we become making sure that we're understanding what we need and meeting those needs before we need them. And so you have to be proactive in your thinking. So instead of letting the whole district, just fall into total disrepair, we were trying to be understanding of what falls into these categories, what are we doing about it, and let's improve things. And we did several improvements, and it really helped a lot. So now, as you look at your annual budget, and remember, your budget is your forecast, and then, then you have your real budget, and you kind of see how closely those align. Basically, you have your operating expenditures, and that's for instruction and support. Those do not qualify for bonds. You have your capital expenditures, and this is where you have your construction, equipment, renovations, and so on. And so you're looking at those, and when you're planning your budget, and you're seeing if you're going to run a bond, and if that bond is successful, there will be, will impact what you're budgeting and what actually happens in reality. So you have to think about how to balance this. What if the bond doesn't pass? What if it does pass? What does this look like? So the numbers will be very, very different. And then, of course, if you're engaging in not a sinking fund, but any other corporate or municipal bond, then you're going to have a long-term liability here, and that has to be recognized as well in your budget. So when you get bond ratings, you make that decision if you want to do it or not. There is a cost to it. You have to provide the information to the voters and what the yield is and so on. So do you want to pay the cost, and your yield, it will change your yield to be more favorable because you're paying for the rating. The non-rating saves money, but however, it's not as highly thought of by investors. And so usually if you're just going to do a very small local bond, you might not want to spend the money on it to take care of that renovation. So the bond rating, you're thinking about this, and normally, like I said, you'd hire a consultant to go through that process. And then the rating is done, if you're going to do it, by Standard & Poor's. It's an economically based evaluation, and or Moody's, and many systems have both, where you're looking at a short-term municipal bond or outstanding debt is normally where those are handled. So those are the common ones, and you'll hear about these. It makes a difference if you're going to have a AAA bond rating or a single A or a B or whatever. It makes a big difference in terms of investors and what you have to pay them in interest to be willing to invest in the system, in the bond. So if you're purchasing the bond insurance, again, your consultant will make this decision, but it's maybe a good idea if it's investment grade or large enough, because if it's insured, then what's happening, it's just like the FDIC does for our banks. If you put $250,000 in a bank, if it's FDI insured, if the bank goes bust, you're going to get your $250 back. It's insured by the government. So that's what bond insurance is like. If someone's going to invest and buy a corporate or municipal bond, this insurance will make sure that they're going to get, will get their funds back or part of their funds back. This also raises the credit rating and makes the bond more desirable, and therefore can reduce the cost of the bond. So if you don't need a higher rating, then you don't necessarily need it. But, again, you have to make those decisions, and a consultant will usually help you with that. Now, why do bonds fail? You can see that schools need bonds, and we're running around trying to have bond campaigns put out there. And you can see, that this is happening. And so failures do happen. Poor economic conditions. If you have a lot of retirees in your school system, they don't want to pay more. They're on fixed incomes. Or if there's distrust or cynicism, if you've had a poor achievement or poor academic record, again, that idea of academic return on investment is great. But if bonds do pass and the school system does become upgraded, that does positively impact real estate values. So retirees can benefit from that, as well as other members of the community who own property. So in back in the 60s, we had pretty good bond passage. Again, those were kind of the golden years where we always saw, increasing in school funding as an opportunity. And you can see down to 85, we didn't pass as many. And now, it's the same way. It's kind of swung on the upside a little bit from where it was a few years ago. But this is definitely, a cyclical process. Leadership is critical in this. And you can see when school leaders are effective at this, it really works well. What we're looking for is less often rather than more often. So you're very careful about when you run these bonds. They're not run frequently, and you have to be diplomatic, strategic, politically astute, and symbolically aware of what they mean. Also, you have to be thinking about matching funds that might be made available if it passes, and where those might come from, and how the community regards this whole thing. In some communities, this is very, very distasteful and doesn't stand a chance. Well, I hope that helps you today, understanding a little bit more about this, how this all works, and hope you enjoy the class, and I'm looking forward to reading your work. Thanks, everybody.